So, when we talk about protecting species, one of the biggest threats that we discuss is habitat loss and fragmentation. As humans continue to develop more land for agriculture, for cities, for resource extraction, we are breaking up the natural landscape into smaller and smaller patches that can lead to negative consequences for species. But there is an exciting field of research out there that is looking at creative ways to mitigate those negative effects, and is called wildlife corridors. Hi, and welcome to this channel. Wildlife corridors, also known as ecological corridors, green bridges or wildlife passages, are areas of habitat that are specifically designed to connect two or more fragmented habitats. The idea is that by providing a safe passage between these fragments, animals can move between them, which helps to maintain gene flow, find new resources, or access new mates, all while avoiding some of the dangerous areas that humans have created. In today's episode, we were going to look at some recent studies that are investigating how well these corridors work and what we can do to make them better. So, why do we care about habitat fragmentation? Well, it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem as our human population grows and expands. For example, let's say we have a large forested area that has lots of different species living in it. And then as humans move in, we start clearing parts of that forest for development. What you'll end up with is a bunch of smaller forested areas surrounded by non-forested areas. And that's called habitat fragmentation. And it can be really bad news for the species that live there. For example, a fragmented population of black bears in the southeastern US has lower genetic diversity than a continuous population. That means they have fewer genetic options to adapt to future changes. They're just not as resilient. And in some cases, populations that are too small or too isolated can go extinct. That's why we try to protect large, intact areas of habitat when possible. It's the best way to ensure that species within it don't face extinction. But sometimes habitat loss is inevitable, whether it's due to development, agriculture, resource extraction, or even climate change. So then we want to find the next best thing to preserving intact habitat, which is where corridors come in. The idea is that if we can allow animals to move between habitat fragments, we can avoid some of the pitfalls of habitat loss. Now, why would we want animals to be able to move between habitat fragments? Well, there are three main reasons. The first is to help with gene flow. Gene flow is the transfer of genetic material from one population to another through reproduction. It's how genetic diversity is maintained and how new genetic variants can arise. When populations are fragmented, gene flow between them can be reduced, which can lead to the problems we talked about earlier, like low genetic diversity. But corridors can help to maintain gene flow by providing a pathway for individuals to move between populations and breed. The second reason is to help with movement. Animals need to be able to move around their habitat in order to find food, find mates, and raise their young. Corridors can provide animals with the space they need to move around, especially in situations where the surrounding areas are too dangerous to traverse. For example, some animals might not be able to cross busy roads or areas with lots of cars because it is too dangerous for them. So in these situations, a corridor could provide a safe passage for animals to move from one side of the road to the other. And the third reason is to help with colonization. Sometimes corridors can help animals colonize new areas. So this happens when animals move into an area where they haven't lived before. This can be important for species that are expanding their range or recolonizing areas that they've been wiped out from. For example, corridors might help amphibians move into areas that have been devastated by wildfires so they can repopulate those areas after the disaster. So now that we know why corridors are beneficial, let's take a look at some recent studies that are investigating how well they work. In a study published in 2023 in the journal Biological Conservation, Researchers wanted to see how corridors affected the genetic diversity of an endangered species of Chinese giant salamander. They looked at 3 populations of the salamanders, one that was continuous, meaning it wasn't fragmented, and 2 that were fragmented but had corridors connecting them. The researchers found that the salamanders and the fragmented populations with corridors had higher genetic diversity than those without corridors. This suggests that the corridors were helping to maintain gene flow between the salamanders and the fragmented populations. Now, the researchers also found that the amount of genetic diversity in the salamanders was related to the quality of the corridor. Specifically, the salamanders that used higher quality corridors had more genetic diversity. Higher quality corridors in this case meant that the corridor was closer to the salamander's original habitat. This makes sense because if the corridor is more similar to the salamander's preferred habitat, then it's more likely that they'll use it. Now, in another study published in 2022 in the journal Landscape Ecology, researchers wanted to see how corridors affected the movement of a group of animals called flying foxes. Flying foxes are fruit bats that are found in Australia and New Guinea. They're important seed dispersers in their ecosystems, but they're also often persecuted by humans because they can damage crops and carry diseases. The researchers used GPS data loggers to track the movement of flying foxes in an area that had been fragmented by agriculture. They found that the flying foxes were more likely to use corridors that were closer to their roosting sites and that were connected to larger areas of forest. This suggests that the corridors were helping the flying foxes to move between roosting sites and to access larger areas of forest for foraging. Now, one of the challenges of building corridors is figuring out where to put them. You want them to be in places that will be most useful to the animals that you're trying to help. And that's where some really cool research is being done on the connectivity of the landscape. Connectivity is basically a measure of how easily animals can move through a landscape. A highly connected landscape is one in which animals can move easily from one area to another, while a disconnected landscape is one in which there are barriers to movement. For example, a road or an agricultural field might act as a barrier to movement for some animals, while a forest or a wetland might not. Researchers are developing tools to map the connectivity of the landscape based on how animals move. These tools can help us to identify areas where corridors would be most helpful. And this is especially important in places where we're planning on doing some sort of development. By mapping the connectivity of the landscape, we can identify areas where corridors would be most helpful in maintaining connectivity and allowing animals to move through the area. One such tool is called Circuitscape, which is a software program that allows you to model how animals move through a landscape. Circuitscape takes into account things like the type of habitat in the landscape, the quality of the habitat, and any barriers to movement, such as roads or buildings. Once you've created a model in Circuitscape, you can see how animals would move through the landscape and identify areas where corridors would be most helpful. Another tool that's being used is called the resistance distance tool. This tool calculates the resistance distance between 2 points in a landscape. Resistance distance is basically the cost of moving between 2 points in a landscape, taking into account things like the type of habitat and any barriers to movement. The tool uses a resistance surface, which is a map that shows the resistance to movement at different locations in the landscape. Once you have a resistance distance, you can see the relative costs of moving between different locations and identify areas where corridors would be most helpful in reducing the cost of movement. These tools are being used in a variety of places to help with conservation planning. One example is in the Netherlands, where a group of researchers is using Circuitscape to help with the planning of wind farms. Wind farms can be harmful to birds if they collide with the blades. So the researchers are using Circuitscape to identify areas where wind farms would have the least impact on bird movement. Another example is in Australia, where a group of researchers is using the resistance distance tool to identify areas where corridors would be most helpful for a small flightless bird called the murgu. Overall, the research on wildlife corridors is very promising. Corridors can help to maintain gene flow, movement, and colonization in fragmented landscapes. And there are tools available to help us identify where corridors would be most helpful. As our human population continues to grow and expand, we'll need to find ways to coexist with wildlife. Wildlife corridors are one promising approach to achieving that coexistence. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel to keep up with all of our latest episodes. Thanks for watching. See you next time.